Thank you very much for joining us today. It's nice to see some familiar names and also some new ones joining us for the second webinar on soil carbon, the fundamentals. My name is Catherine Colbert. I'm from Partners in Ag. I would like to thank the Wimmera Catchment Management Authority for giving us the opportunity to partner on this project. It has been supported by the National Landcare Program. I would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional owners on the land on which we all meet today, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The chat function today will be monitored, so if you have any questions as we go through, please use the chat function. There'll also be plenty of time at the end to ask questions. So that's enough from me. I will hand over to Declan. For those who weren't here for webinar one, or haven't been had the privilege of seeing Declan present previously. Declan has over 30 years of experience in soil and horticultural management in a variety of roles in both the public and private sector. He is passionate about providing farmers with tools to improve their land's condition, improve profitability, and ultimately reduce stress. I'll hand over to you, Declan.
Thanks, Catherine. Good morning, everybody. And I had a little shock for a second there when Catherine said that this was soil carbon fundamentals, and I remembered, oh, okay. Well, we covered kind of the fundamentals last week, but this week I'm taking you on a kind of deeper dive into soil carbon. But and because we really only have 2 webinars, I want to take you to what I think is the heart of the matter when it comes to managing soil carbon in low rainfall environments, and as a cornerstone to sustaining production as we go forward. Now I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you've got the opening slides there. I'll trust that you can all see that. Now, just by way of a quick recap, last week we talked about soil organic matter as the lifeblood of soils. You know, without organic matter, you've just basically got a pile of rocks in your soil. So organic matter is the fuel that drives energy flows in the soil, that drives nutrient cycling, that drives soil health, basically. We talked about there being different pools of soil carbon and how they all need to be turning over just like cash in the economy. We talked about how soils work in terms of the relationship between plants and microbes and how they have, you know, evolved over millions of years to meet each other's needs, and from a plant's point of view, to have nutrients supplied by the soil. We also talked, though, about how in our efforts to, better manage agriculture and increase production, soil organic matter, soil organic carbon has declined, and our dependence on fertilizers has increased. We talked about the critical role between soil organic carbon and soil structure, and I'm going to touch on that again today because that is just so important. And we talked about the role of plant roots in promoting soil structure and really in driving energy flows into the soil, because you'll recall we said that, you know, the plant is the original primary producer. It's making sugar out of air and water and putting that sugar into the soil in various forms, which is driving soil function. So this week, it's all about carbon. And I asked Catherine to send out to you that kind of scenario from Dr. Susan Orgel, which I thought was really nice. You know, she talked about, said, you know, carbon, that's all that's currently being talked about. My kids want me to do something to help the environment, and there seems to be lots of benefits to improving soil carbon. I don't want to miss out if there's money to be made from carbon credits or other benefits, but I hear it's tricky to change levels and to tell if you're doing it, and you seem to need to do lots of testing over it, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so it's a confusing space. So I hope today I'm going to take away from some of that confusion and not add to it. So a lot of people think, you know, soil carbon's either or, you know, either you're increasing soil carbon for the environment or you're going to focus on productivity. I think, you know, to our detriment in the agricultural soil science communities, you know, we have really focused on the whole productivity thing because of the great tools that we developed as part of the Green Revolution. And we kind of forgot about the fact that we really need to sustain the resource at the same time as enjoying good productivity when we can get it. So my approach is really about trying to have our cake and eat it, which means producing profitable crops or meat and wool while improving the natural capital of our soil. And it's that second part that has not been front and center in our discussions to date. So what's the best way to increase soil carbon? Well, you know, people talk about compost, cover crops, pasture renovators, biological stimulants, like all of these things are in the mix, but the easiest and cheapest way to increase soil carbon is to grow it. So we'll talk more about that as we go through. Will you get paid for it? Well, there's a couple of ways you can get paid for it. The government is offering carbon credits for people who sequester carbon, but for farmers who are able to increase the amount of soil carbon, they're going to get paid doubly because of increases in production. And you're going to make far more money that way than you will ever get from the government. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. How will I know when you get there? Well, I'll say now, you might never get there, because it's going to take a long time to reach that upper limit of soil organic matter that soils can hold. But you can get 80% of the way there in 20% of the time. The last 20% can take a long time. But what it means is in the short term, there's substantial gains to be made. Now, the important things about soil carbon, and we'll kind of refer back to this list as we go through. I want to talk about the things that influence carbon capture and the things that lose it. You know, how much organic matter does my soil need? How often does it need it? The role of soil biology in reducing risk, and soil carbon and fertilizer use. What's the connection between the two? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the ERF and carbon credits, but I'll put it in there. So remembering from last week that you know, organic carbon is, you know, carbon. We talked briefly about the carbon cycle, and you know, at one instance, you know, a whole bunch of carbon is in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. In another moment, the carbon is in our bodies as part of our physical makeup and the bodies of every other animal on the planet. And carbon is in the plant, and carbon is in the sea, and carbon is in the soil. So carbon is everywhere. You know, we're a carbon planet. And so carbon is cycling all the time. And what we're doing is we're managing that cycling process. So we're taking carbon from the atmosphere, it's entering plants, it's building plant tissue, that plant is dying down, it's feeding the microbes in the soil, they're taking carbon into their bodies, they're cycling that carbon through the soil, some of it is being sequestered in the soil in a permanent form, and then some of that carbon is being lost from the soil through microbial respiration and respiration of plant roots. So why have we lost so much carbon? Well, mainly through clearing and cultivation. And we talked about this graph last week, and talked about the precipitous drop in soil carbon following clearing. And what it shows here is that just about every soil has got the potential to increase carbon from where we are now. So one of the things, you know, what happens when we cultivate? Well, we understand that soil microbes are not uniformly distributed throughout soil. So I got this idea of maybe how to illustrate this, and I found these couple of you know, nighttime satellite photographs of America and Australia. And if you can picture America here as being a particularly fertile soil, it's got lots of lights, and for the lights read, you know, concentration of soil microbes. And what this is showing is in a land that's pretty fertile with a lot of young soils, and particularly the eastern half of the United States is where all the really fertile soils are. Well, surprise, surprise, look at the microbial population of that part of the soil. In contrast, look at Australia, and you can see that the microbial concentration is around where the better soils are and where the better water is, and that tends to be in a much more distributed fashion in Australia. Now, these are two soil types, right? So if you take either of these soil types and you put a plow or a rotary hoe or a power harrow or any kind of implement like that through, you're going to mash it all up and mix it all together. So what that means is that if I look at the map of America, for example, the dark places between the light, there's organic matter there, but there's no microbes there. So when we mash it all up, we're mixing the microbes with the soil organic matter. And hey presto, we're presenting them with food, and they go, thank you very much. They get stuck into it, and they so much of that organic matter then gets released as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The bugs die off when the feed runs out, and so we have a depleted organic matter level in our soil. That's what happens when we clear. That's what happens when we cultivate. So our challenge is saying, okay, well, how can we put organic matter back into this system to sustain soil health and to sustain productivity? You'll remember we talked about part of our problem in growing limited number of plant species, whether that's in a cropping situation or a pasture situation. We remove the deep roots. We have a concentration of relatively shallow roots, or we really lose diversity in our root system, and that impoverishes the soil just by virtue of the reduced range of inputs going into the soil and the reduced diversity of microbes as a result of that. You'll remember we talked about soil structure, and if it's not maintained particularly deeper down in the soil, we have a collapse of the pore network, just like an abandoned mine. This was an interesting graphic here that I pulled out of my collection during the week. We've got some really great tools now with CT scans and X-ray type of technologies, which allow us to look into soils and see the pore network in soils. And what this is showing is the comparison between a soil with two managements. And the one on the right was trafficked 4 times by a heavy sugar beet harvester 14 years prior to sampling. So the damage that was done to the pore network from heavy machinery and compaction is still evident in the CT scan on the right compared to the untrafficked soil on the left. So we don't really appreciate the damage that we do with compaction, with heavy machinery, and the time it takes, the time it can take to restore those soils without resolute effort. Now, these are just a couple of photographs that I took. This is on a farm up near Stanhope in central Victoria. Kind of classic sodic dispersive clay soil. And this is just on the edge of the resown area. And I happened to notice these lines of trash just on the end of the field, and noticed underneath them, the soil is aggregating, where this organic matter is breaking down and, essentially some of it is solubilizing and moving into the soil. And you see that the soil is aggregating underneath the straw. So this is what the soil is trying to do, and the opportunity that it has when organic matter is present. You can see where there's no organic matter on the left and the right, we have sealing of the soil surface just from rainfall, but we have an open soil surface just where that organic line of stubble lies. So what we were looking at there was the reformation of aggregates and how organic matter is driving that aggregation of soil particles. And this is some work from the United States, but it's basically showing that in the perennial plot, this is year 4 of lucerne and red clover. The double crop soils were oat and wheat. The summer annuals, it was year 4 corn after lucerne and corn after red clover, and the summer annuals were continuous corn, corn after soybean, and soybean after corn. So what this is showing is the summer annuals really had the toughest time, and that's to do with the amount of cultivation in terms of the proportion of water stable aggregates. Up where we had the perennial system, and even where we had the double crop small grains, we had much higher proportion of water stable aggregates. And this is all to do with the amount of organic material going back into the soil. So we want to talk about how much soil organic does my organic matter does my soil need, and how often does it need it. So this is some work taken from one of the longest running continuous experiments in Britain, which is still running to the present day. And what it's showing is that there are three treatments here. The purple line is manure addition that's been continuous for 100 and whatever years, 160 years. We have manure that was added and then stopped, is the blue line, and then the kind of grey line is the control with no additions. So the control line, I'll talk about the purple line first. What this is showing, remember I was saying about the 80-20 rule, how in the short term, when we start looking after organic matter, we have a relatively rapid increase in organic matter, but to fill the soil up, if you like, takes a very long time. And this is where all soils have an equilibrium level, where there's a maximum level of soil organic matter that they're able to sequester. And it takes soils quite a long time to get there. Where organic matter is added and then stopped, this graph shows that soil carbon inputs must be maintained to ensure that it continues to increase, because otherwise we have a situation where the soil microbes build up in response to the available feed. They eat that all down, and if it's not replaced, then we're back to square one. This is some modeled data from CSIRO, courtesy of Jeff Baldock, and he's showing that in a wheat fallow rotation, we have this kind of gradual step change in the total organic carbon status of the soil. And when we break that down, we can see that the humus is dropping kind of steadily, but the particulate organic matter, which we talked about last week, you'll recall, vanishes pretty quickly. That's the first thing to go upon disturbance and cultivation. And this is kind of bouncing along here at the bottom, which kind of represents, annual inputs, but that material is quickly lost as well. So at 33 years, the land is converted to permanent pasture, and we see a bounce in the total soil organic carbon coming back up here, the red line, a gradual increase in the humus and a bounce in the particulate fraction. The brown line here shows what it used to be called inert carbon. We don't call it inert carbon anymore. The recalcitrant fraction, which is primarily a product of fire, and it is generally fairly stable in soils and tends not to change very much, although our thinking around that is changing too. So what this is showing is, at 15 years and at 13 years post-conversion, we're back up to a similar level of soil carbon. But when we look at the fractions again, we'll see that the humus has not rebounded to nearly the same level as it was at year 15. In fact, it's still probably maybe 3 or 4 tons short of where it was in year 15. But what has bounced is the particulate matter, which was always going to come back more quickly when we switched to permanent pasture. But we need to understand the difference here. So this soil is not going to be in the same condition that it was in year 15 because we have a lot less humus, even though we have the same amount of total carbon. So it's useful to understand the dynamics of soil carbon recovery and what we can expect from the soil, depending on whether that recovery is in the particulate fraction or in the humus fraction. Now, I want this to move on. Here we go. So I want to talk now about the role of soil biology in reducing risk. And when I'm talking about reducing risk, I'm talking about making our soils more resilient in the face of climate change, climate variability, increased wet and dry. What can we do to meet these challenges going forward? Well, you recall last week we talked about, this is your fundamental breakdown of soil. We've got 45% mineral particles, 25% air, 25% water, and we've got this relatively small proportion here of 5% organic matter, of which only 10% of that, so 0.5%, is living organisms. But it's what goes on in this little piece of the pie here that breathes life into all of the rest of it. Think of this a little bit like your computer chip. When we plug this in, we bring everything else to life. If we haven't got this chip plugged in, as I said before, we've just got a pile of rocks. So how does this give effect to everything that happens in the soil? This is a piece of work that I did quite a few years ago now, looking at the role of invertebrates on Tasmanian farms. And it's kind of introducing the cast, if you like. So we talk about microorganisms, and you see going from top left, we've got fungi and bacteria, protozoa, amoeba, nematodes, and we're gradually getting bigger here. The collembola and the mites, they perform really important roles in soil in nutrient cycling because they are shredding organic matter. Some mites are preying on other mites. And so all of these organisms, they all have a role to play in processing organic material, in decomposing organic material, and in releasing nutrients from that organic material and cycling that back through into the soil. This was from the same piece of work, and reminding you again that where we have really high numbers of arthropods, which are these the organisms that are not bacteria and fungi, so the things that are nearly visible to the naked eye or visible with low magnification, huge numbers under very stable perennial systems, and those numbers dropping to the right, really in line with the amount of disturbance. And again, that disturbance is to do with the loss of organic matter in these systems and the destruction of habitat and the amount of energy that soil organisms have to put into then, breeding back up their numbers after a major disturbance and re-establishing soil function. So you're probably all familiar with the idea of nutrient drawdown, nutrient immobilization. We often hear about it in terms of nitrogen drawdown, where if there's not enough nitrogen in the soil, or if there's too much fresh organic matter, say, has been applied to the soil, we can see plants yellowing up, and we know that they'll grow out of that yellowing eventually, but there may be a significant cost to that. So generally we'll try and get out with some nitrogen, for example, to overcome that nutrient drawdown. But what is happening when we get that nutrient drawdown? Well, what's happening is that the microbes are competing with the plants for available nutrients, and the microbes will always win. So the microbes will grab what available nutrient there is, and they will sequester that into their own bodies to do the work that they want to do. And it's only when they run out of food and their population starts dying down that the nutrient is again released. And this is where, if you don't apply anything, eventually you'll see the plants green up again as the nutrients start to cycle again in the soil. Now, the old consensus around organic matter I'm going to connect these points in a second, but the old consensus about organic matter sequestration in the soil. So when farmers used to say to us, how do I increase organic matter in my soil? We'd say, oh, grow a bigger crop, apply fertilizer, grow a bigger crop. Organic matter is a product of vegetative bulk and the type of vegetation. So more ligniferous material is going to result in more stable soil carbon. The new consensus is that organic matter is a product of microbial detritus and vegetative inputs. But we're less thinking about the type of vegetation. It's more about the range of vegetation types that can drive organic matter sequestration. And this understanding is supported by a growing understanding that microbial detritus contributes 59 to 64% of total soil carbon in arable, ag, and grasslands, respectively, around the world. And this is a major study that was done by CSIRO, which is an amazing revelation when we consider that we haven't really considered the contribution of the soil organisms to carbon sequestration. So these are the workers in the factory that we have largely ignored. So when we talk about what is the ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio of the soil, most of you might be able to tell us that, well, it's probably around 12 to 1. Even 15 to 1 is good. But we need that ratio of carbon to nitrogen because this is, if you like, but these are ratios that are determined by nature. So this is an example of what some of those ratios look like. So this is telling us what the carbon to nitrogen and other element ratios are in humans, in alfalfa, in an insect, in bacteria. And you can see, sadly, that we're really not that different from the insects and the bacteria in terms of our general makeup. But what this is showing here is that alfalfa, interestingly enough, has got a carbon to nitrogen ratio probably of around 13 to 1. The insect has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 5 to 1. The bacterium, well, actually that's close to 4 to 1. Similarly with the bacteria. So what this means is these are little nitrogen capsules. So there is surplus nitrogen in these bodies. So when we get nutrient immobilization, this is where it is. It's locked up in these bodies. So when a bacterium spills its guts, as it were, there's going to be surplus nitrogen available. So this is how nutrients, nitrogen and other nutrients, are cycling in the soil. Now, you're going to have to bear with me here because I'm going to get just a little bit more technical to illustrate this point. So if we want to sequester soil organic matter, these are the ratios of soil organic matter. So if we have 10 parts of carbon, we need 0.8 parts of nitrogen, 0.2 parts of sulfur, phosphorus, 0.14 of sulfur, etc. So if we want to sequester 1 ton of carbon as soil organic matter, we'll need to have 83 kilos of N, 20 kilos of P, 40, etc. in the soil. It also means that if I have 5% soil organic matter in the soil, I've got 50 tons of soil organic matter. If I've got 50 tons of soil organic matter, I've got a lot of carbon and I've got a lot of nitrogen that has the potential to cycle in this system. Now, this doesn't mean that if I want to sequester a ton of carbon of soil organic matter, I need to apply 83 kilos of nitrogen. Not the case. Nitrogen, there's a lot of nitrogen that is supplied by the soil, both in the form of legumes, if we're growing them, but also in the form of free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And some soils have very high proportions of free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And our job is to facilitate their population and their contributions. Now, I'm going to hit you with a big word here, which to again illustrate this point, this nutrient stoichiometry. Now, all stoichiometry is the natural balance of elements in our systems. So when you go to the doctor and the doctor takes a blood test and they look at your cholesterol, they're going to say, okay, well, we need your LDLs to be here and your other cholesterols to be there and this to be here and this to be there. So our bodies have this capacity to achieve what's called homeostasis, which is the correct balance of everything. And if you have the correct balance of everything in your body, you're going to be healthy. If a plant has the correct balance of everything in its body, it's going to be healthy. And our genetic programming is what determines what those proportions are and how those proportions are maintained. Okay, so that's all that stoichiometry is. So when we look at fresh organic matter, and that might be a mix of animal manures and stubbles and whatever else that we apply to our paddocks, we might have 10,000 parts of carbon. We have 260 parts of nitrogen, 32 parts of phosphorus, 48 parts of sulfur. In soil organic matter that has been stabilized, that's been processed, that's cured, so this is humus, we have 10,000 parts of carbon, 833 parts of nitrogen, 200 of phosphorus, 143 of sulfur. These are the same proportions that I was just talking about. But in microorganisms, if we have 10,000 parts of carbon, we've got nearly 1,500 parts of nitrogen, nearly 450 parts of phosphorus. So this is the little nutrient bomb that I was talking about. We've got all these nutrients that are in microorganisms. So when these guys start turning over their carbon, suddenly the surplus in the soil for plant growth, for nutrient cycling, and for carbon sequestration. So we talked about these fixed ratios of soil organic matter. So in agricultural systems, stoichiometrically balanced nutrient addition to fresh organic matter can increase carbon transfer to soil organic matter by 6 to 52%, and importantly, reduce the mineralization of the soil organic matter that's already in the soil. So in other words, it's going to help keep that soil organic matter there. And this comes from this particular piece of research by CSIRO and ANU. And they're saying the future research to quantify economic environmental implications is warranted. They're talking about a paradigm shift in thinking to focus on the nutrient requirements of the whole soil plant system. I'm going to pause here a little bit because this is a lot of information to take in. So what I've just been talking about is, over the last 70 years, we have gotten really, really good at plant nutrition. We have gotten really good at determining what nutrients plants need to grow. At the same time, the condition of our soil is not improving. The natural capital of our soil, in terms of its soil organic matter content, its structure, its aeration, its drainage, we're not seeing significant improvements in that, and we're seeing a lot of erosion and all other kinds of problems associated with our soil. Because we haven't been thinking about how do we build soil, how do we improve the quality of our soil while we're growing our profitable crops. So now, and this also explains why we have not been able to sequester carbon, even though we have been growing in good years bulk crops. It's because we haven't been paying enough attention to the processes that are going on below the ground. The processes, what I've been talking about, the processes that sequester carbon, that increase soil organic matter, are driven by soil microorganisms. Soil microorganisms have a different requirement for nutrients than plants do. So in supplying nutrients to the plants, we're feeding the plant, but we're starving the soil. So we have to think about a whole soil plant system rather than the agronomic requirements of the crops alone. This is revolutionary. this is a really, really huge shift in our thinking around sustaining agriculture, particularly in low rainfall or challenging environments. So the whole emphasis, therefore, needs to come around to thinking about how do we manage above ground livestock, below ground livestock, above ground crops, below ground livestock. The things that influence, what we want to move on to now is soil carbon and fertilizer use. Is there a connection? We talked about this a bit last week, showing that so much nitrogen is tied up in the organic fraction of the soil, and the nitrogen that we add is generally going straight into the plant. It's not feeding the soil. What this very spectacular looking graph is telling us is that is basically how, if we were to increase the organic matter input into the soil every year, and if that's through the use of cover crops, intercropping, compost, returning more stubble to the soil, we have an increase in soil organic matter, but also an increase in the available nitrogen that is coming out of that soil organic matter every year. Now, nitrogen is the most competed element in the soil, and microbes, as I said before, will always get there first. So what it means is, if you were to add a ton of compost to a hectare, only 10% of the nitrogen in that compost is going to be available to the next crop. Which is why a lot of farmers say, oh, I tried compost and nothing happened, because we're looking for a response. You're not going to get a response from compost in that way. Compost does a different job in the soil. But what it means is that if we apply a ton of compost every year, and we get 10% every year, and we get 10% in year 2 from year 1's application, and we get about 5% in year 3, and we get a little bit every year from earlier years' applications of compost, you can see that we have this increasing availability of nitrogen as we go forward, as that old material continues to release some of its nitrogen, and the new material continues to release some of its nitrogen every year. There's an abundance of research that shows the relationship between soil properties and microbial activity. And this is some work that was done by a researcher up at UNE in New South Wales. You know, a really strong relationship between the total organic carbon and microbial activity, total nitrogen and microbial activity, carbon to nitrogen ratio and microbial activity, and phosphorus availability and microbial activity. So these guys are trying to do the right thing by us. We had to try and do the right thing by them. So when it comes to putting all of this into practice, if we understand that most increase in soil carbon is going to come from microbial detritus, what can we do to grow biology? We've touched on so many of these things already, but now it's about pulling them together. So we want more diversity in plant material. We want to minimize fallows as much as we can. We want to maintain minimum grazing residuals, protect ground cover in pasture systems. We want to reduce or buffer the chemical use on farm. We want to connect with like-minded people. Mallee Sustainable Farming, Vic No-Till, people like Colin Syce and his pasture cropping. Soils for Life is an organization set up by the late Michael Jeffries, and they have produced a range of case studies from all around the country, looking at different land uses, different management systems, but all with a focus on increasing soil resilience and soil capacity. So things like cover cropping and intercropping and the use of stripper headers are all parts of, they're all strategies that we can use to increase the return of organic matter into the soil. So I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to invite discussion on some of these kind of complex ideas that I've put forward, but more importantly, I want to talk about some of these practices that we can apply, and how we can overcome some of the challenges that we're dealing with in real world situations, to say, well, how can we make some of this work, given the challenging environments that we're farming in. Okay, Catherine, back to you.
Great, thank you very much for that, Declan. Are there any questions from the group? I've just allowed cameras back on, so if you do have a question, turn your camera on, unmute yourself, and we can have a chat.
Do you want to, I think Lockie had a couple of questions that sent in. Do you want to kick off with those, Catherine?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Lockie, for sending these through. Is it worth joining any carbon credit schemes, or is it better to wait?
Okay, that's quite a topical question at the moment, because there's been a bit of noise around a suggestion that some people have exaggerated the capacity of soils to sequester carbon. We basically have a method in Australia determined by the Clean Energy Regulator that's described in the Carbon Farming Initiative, and it's a very rigorous system, and it's really quite a complex system. But if you're embarking on a program where you have a strong intention to increase soil organic matter, soil carbon in your soils, I think it is worth signing up to the Emission Reduction Fund, because essentially it's going to be, if you like, a bit of money on the side. As I said at the start, almost all of our soils have the potential to increase soil carbon. So our challenge is figuring out how to do that, what's going to work in our environment. It doesn't really cost you very much to register a project. But yes, it can pay, and the price of carbon is going to go up. There's no doubt the price of carbon is going to go up. So I think it's worthwhile getting on board. It's a very complicated thing to undertake by yourself, but there are a bunch of aggregators around who will help you through the process. They take a cut, of course. They have their own fee structures, but they make the whole process pain-free. So there's people like AgriProve and Carbon Link are two of the bigger ones that I can think of who are very active in this space. But as I said before, the big payday is going to happen through increased productivity, increased nutrient use efficiency, increased water holding capacity, your ability to grow a crop when your neighbors are failing because you have higher levels of soil carbon in your soil. That's where it's really going to pay, and that would be the primary motivation for increasing soil carbon.
Okay, and the follow-up question for that, is there a better time to join a carbon credit scheme, for example, after a drought, as carbon is lost from the soil during drought? So is it better to start off at a lower point to sort of maximize results?
Look, not really. I mean, it's true that yes, carbon will dip after an extended drought, but it's not going to, it's not going to fluctuate so much under a given management regime. It's really about what changes you make in your management that is going to start making material changes to the level of soil carbon. So I'd say just, sign up anytime that works for you.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions from the group? No, I've got one more. Might give them an extra couple of minutes to think of a question. Is it possible to raise the carbon levels in soil through grazing management and compost in thick black soils, or is their carbon levels already at a maximum?
Yes, definitely, it's possible to lift that. There's very few soils where carbon would be at a maximum. The only soils where carbon would be at a maximum really would be undisturbed soils, or soils that have had a long history of carbon inputs. Under grazing management, we unfortunately we have a history of kind of shooting ourselves in the foot in grazing systems in Australia, because of our focus. Our focus is so strongly on livestock, and for good reason and bad, protecting genetic lines and attachment to animals, or whatever reason. They tend to be the last thing to go. So we see so much overgrazing happening when it stops raining, when we're running out of feed. Either we're super optimistic and we think, oh, I'll hang on, it'll rain, and it doesn't, and we end up with severely bare. This is how we lose so much carbon. So I maintain that you cannot bare the ground in a grazing system. If you bare the ground, you're in overdraft, you're losing money hand over fist. At a minimum, we have to keep clothes on our back, and that means we have to keep cover on the ground. If we lose cover, we're losing carbon, we're losing natural capital, we're going backwards. And it's always then a big step up to try and recover from those impacts. So the way to build carbon in grazing systems is, firstly, determine what your minimum residuals are, the line that you will not go past, the level of dry matter, and pick a number that can be 1,000 kilos of dry matter per hectare. Pick a number that you won't go past. That's how you safeguard the money in the bank. How you build money in the bank then is trying to lengthen the rotation of your grazing, so that you allow the plants to grow up, develop big roots, promote soil biological activity, feed the soil at the same time as feeding your animals. So this is in direct kind of conflict with the 3-leaf stage in a lot of grazing systems, which has a very pure focus on animal weight gain. And certainly there's no doubt about that. But our preferencing the animal and animal production by grazing in that way is not taking care of the below ground livestock, and as a result not sequestering carbon. So that's a whole other kind of complete other session we can do on grazing management, and really developing a grazing management system that is much more appropriate for Australian environments, because the grazing management system that we use, we're still using the Northern Hemisphere model. And in our, rainfall, in our climate, it just doesn't work.
Yes. Yep. No, thank you. Nikki, do you have a question?
Yes. You've just talked about with grazing, what are the key factors that should be considered with those people who are using CTF in their cropping to improve the carbon? That's probably a whole new session.
Sorry, I didn't really get the question, Nikki.
What are the key factors to consider for those that are using CTF in cropping?
Look, control traffic is just fantastic. I mean, it's really the only way we should be cropping. I know easier said than done. I did a lot of work with control traffic on veggies in Tasmania, and that is complicated. So, control traffic, the reason we need to go that way is because, remember that little graphic that I showed you about the impact of on soil structure 14 years later. This is what we're battling with all the time if we have relatively uncontrolled traffic on our cropping paddocks. So controlled traffic just gives the soil a break, allows the soil to breathe, allows it to rebuild structure. And when we allow it to rebuild structure, we're creating the foundation really for bigger root systems, deeper rooting, more vigorous plant growth, and then all the benefits that accrue below ground in response to that. You know, one of the things that we love to talk about in Tassie with controlled traffic is to say to a farmer, when was the last time you bought a smaller tractor? You know, it just doesn't, it's not even kind of part of the thinking. But when you realize that because the condition of your soil is improving so much, you don't need the same horsepower, then, you know, I mean, it's win-win-win, isn't it?
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, it's Ken here. You look, I'm just wondering if something like perennial cereals and pulses would make a massive difference, and where are we in that situation? Also, stripper versus header, the same amount of organic matter still in the paddock.
Well, yeah, it kind of depends on well, just on the last point, stripper versus you know, conventional headers. It's really a question about how much material we're leaving in the paddock, and what we're trying to do is increase the amount of material that we're leaving in the paddock, and that's the, you know, that's the advantage of stripper headers, that we're taking off only grain and we're leaving as much material in the paddock as we possibly can. Your other point about, you know, perennial cereals and legumes, I think you talked about. I mean, any kind of perenniality is going to improve soil outcomes because of the, you know, constant ground cover, constant inputs into the soil. So even when plants are, you know, semi-dormant, there's still some activity, there's still some carbon flowing into the soil. The microorganisms are not drawing down like they are in a fallow situation. They're not drawing down on what carbon is available. So any kind of perenniality, and you know, you mentioned cereals and legumes. You know, grasses and legumes were made in heaven together. You know, they're made to be grown together. We grow them all, you know, completely independently because you know, they're cash crops. But the practice of intercropping, where we're growing a legume underneath our cereals, is a way of getting free nitrogen. It's a way of putting more root diversity into the soil. It's a way of increasing root architecture in the soil. This can be a challenge in water limited systems, but for every other reason, including weed suppression, it is a really good thing to do, but we tend not to do it because of the way we've been taught to farm, if you like. But the more, you know, if we are able to underplant with a legume, we've got a 100% increase in root diversity straight away.
Thank you.
Sorry, thank you, Ken. Any other questions from the group? Declan, in regards to soil testing, are there any specific soil tests to be requesting to be measuring carbon?
Look, the tried and tested soil carbon test is the Walkley Black method, and that's offered by most labs. A lot of labs now are switching over to combustion methods using something like DUMAS or LECO technologies, basically, which burns the burns the material, and the amount of carbon that's released is read by a spectroscopy instrument. They're both very accurate, they're both very tried and true, and what they give you is a total organic carbon figure. Now, it doesn't give you information with regard to the breakdown of those pools, and you recall we talked about the particulate pool, the fast turning over carbon, the humus pool, the slower turning over carbon, and the recalcitrant pool, the pool that's largely as a result of a history of fire. There is a test for the particulate carbon, which is a potassium permanganate oxidization test, which is relatively cheap, and you can unless you know that you're in an environment that had a history of, say, fire stick farming, you can assume that the bulk of the remainder of your organic matter is humus carbon. So if we have this amount of total carbon, total organic carbon, this amount of potassium permanganate oxidizable carbon, then what's left is likely to be mainly humus. It's a little bit academic in a sense, unless you're really trying to understand how the carbon status in your soil is changing. Particulate organic matter is a great way to feed microbial populations quickly during the change process. Or if you're really trying to minimize your fertilizer input, because that's that's a significant nutrient store as well in the soil. But essentially, yeah, any lab will offer either one or both of those tests. And bear in mind too that organic matter changes slowly. So even if you are doing everything right, it might still take a few years for changes in the organic carbon status of your soil to show up in a soil test. So I wouldn't be testing every year. Probably 3 years would be the minimum frequency, but 5 years might be a more realistic time frame to evaluate whether you're getting real change in your carbon, because you are going to get fluctuation. You'll get some variation between tests. So you want to be confident that what you're seeing is really happening.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any other questions before we finish up? No, silence. I think you've given them plenty of information to think about for the rest of the day, Declan. Thank you so much for today and for the first webinar. I have certainly learned a lot myself. Thank you again to the Wimmera Catchment Management Authority for funding the workshop and providing it to the participants for free. I'm hoping that when we end the meeting, the evaluation survey will pop up on your screens. And the recording will be sent via email through a link with the passcode later this afternoon. Thank you everyone very much for attending today. If you do have any follow-up questions after today, please feel free to email them through and we can put together a bit of a question and answer sheet after the fact and send that out to the participants as well. Thank you very much, Declan. That was brilliant. If there's no further questions, we'll finish up for today.
Thanks very much for your time, everybody. Have a good day.